Welcome to Notes 2A. So today we're going to talk about graphing systems of inequality. So you don't need to write down this last thing, but you have those two boxes there, so you can put those 2 points in the two boxes. So the first one is that a system of a linear inequality is a set of two or more inequalities on the same graph. So we're doing what we've done on previous note sheets. You did it last unit where you graph the inequalities. Remember, that's where we talked about dashed versus solid lines, shading up versus shading down. But this time, unlike yesterday where your solution was just where the points crossed, this time the solution is the region where both of those inequalities are shaded. So we're looking for overlapping of shading, and that's going to tell us where our answers are going to lie. So look at this one, for example. Do you see in this region where that shading is overlapping? That would be considered the solution to those two inequalities. So let's take a look at graphing some of these. So sometimes it's really hard to keep track of your shading and your lines. So we're just going to, in that chart there, kind of help you keep track of that. So look at this first one. We have y is less than negative x plus 1. So for this one, you're going to be shading down. Okay, so you're shading down. Okay, and then the line is going to be dotted. So here are how I knows these things. Goodness, I can speak English. Here's how I know these things, okay? We know I'm shading down because the alligator's facing away from the y. And we know our line is dotted because there's no line underneath our inequality sign. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just graph this first line. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 3. And then I'm going down 1 and over 1. And I'm going to go ahead and do a dotted line through there. Now, my shading is down, so I'm going to go ahead and shade that right away. I tell students if you're doing this in one color with your pencil, lightly shade it. Okay, shade it lightly so that you can really see where it's crossing. So let's take a look at the next one. So the next one for the shading, again, the alligator's facing away from the y, so we're going to be shading down. And notice that there's a solid line underneath the inequality symbol. So that means that this line is actually going to be solid. So now I'm going to go through the work of actually shading this line. So we're crossing the y-axis at 3. And then we're going up 2 over 1 because that's our slope. So we're going to draw a solid line going that way. And now we're going to be shading down from that line. So I want to see where my shading overlaps. And to me, it looks like my shading overlaps in this region here. So with your pencil, you really want to shade it in darkly so that you can see where the overlap was. So make it really dark and obvious where that overlap was. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 2. So for number 2, first of all, our shading is going to be up. We're going to shade up. You could also just write up if you wanted to, because the alligator's eating that y. Now I notice there's no line underneath the inequality symbol, so that's going to be dotted. Okay, so we're crossing the y-axis at 1, and then our slope being multiplied by that x is a 1, or 1 over 1. So we're going up 1 over 1, and that's going to be a dotted line. And from there, we're shading up. So I like to do it in different colors on here, but if you just have a pencil, if you shade it lightly, you should be able to tell where that overlap is going to be. Taking a look at this next one, notice that the alligator is facing away from the y, so we're going to be shading down. And there's no line underneath the inequality symbol, so my line is going to be dotted. So we're crossing the y-axis at negative 3, and then we're going up 1 over 1. And we're going to shade that in. So for this line, we need to shade down. Well, in the case of this line, neither of our shadings overlap. So that means that both of these shadings that I'm doing here in red are solutions. Okay, both sides are solutions because they don't overlap. All right, let's take a look at number 3. So for number 3, the alligator is opening towards the y. So that means I'm going to shade up. And there's a solid line underneath the inequality symbol, so that means I need to have a solid line for my line. So again, this is a lot of graphing lines, so make sure that's something you're comfortable with. So we're crossing the y-axis at negative 6, which is right here. And then from there, we're going up 3 and over 1. So I counted up 3, and then I went over 1. And again, I want to have a solid line going through there. Then from that line, I'm going to pick a spot and I'm going to go up and where my pencil lands. So I'm shading up. So So that's for the first line. Now I want to go ahead, I'm going to graph the second line in purple. So our shading, well, I noticed that the alligator is facing away from the Y, so I'm going to be shading down. Then I notice that there's a line underneath it, so I'm going to have a solid line. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 4. And then I'm going down 2 and over 1, and I'm going to do a solid line through there. Then I'm going to pick on that spot on that line, and I'm going to go down from it because that's where my shading is. So then I notice that my shading overlaps in that left corner there. So this right here is my final answer. So make sure you shade that in real nice and dark on your homework sheet. All right, let's take a look at number 4. So for number 4, taking a look at that first equation. Okay, so there is the alligator facing away from the Y. So that means that we're going to shade down. Okay, there's a solid line underneath that inequalities, so then that's going to be a solid line. A solid line. My S's look so weird on here. Okay, taking a look, let's go ahead and graph that one. So to start off with, we're crossing the y-axis at 3, and then we're going up 1 over 1. Remember, this is the same as having a 1 out front. Up 1 over 1. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to graph a solid line going through there. Then we're going to pick a spot on the line and we're going to go down. Okay, so that's our first line. Let's take a look at our second line. I'm going to do that one in red. So we're crossing the Y, so the alligator is opening towards the Y. So that means we're going to shade up. All right, then I look and I see that there's no solid line underneath, so that means that my line itself has to be dotted. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 2, and then this is the same as a -1 or a -1 over 1 for my slope. So that means I'm going down 1, right 1, and I have a dotted line going through there. And then I'm going to shade up from that line. So I see that my shading overlaps in this pink area right here. So you want to make it really obvious where your overlap is. So this right here is my overlap and my solution of shading. So everything in this corner right here is considered a solution to the inequality. Let's take a look at a couple more examples. So let's take a look at number 5. So for number 5, again, I notice that the alligator is opening towards the Y, so I'm going to shade up. And then I also notice that the line does not have a solid line underneath it, so then the line is going to be dotted because the inequality doesn't have a line underneath it. So I'm crossing the y-axis at a -2. And then my slope is 3 over 1. So then I'm going to be going up 3 and over 1 and plotting that point, which is going to be dotted. And I'm going to shade up from that line. Let's take a look at this next line over here. So I'm going to do that in light blue. So this one, I see that the alligator is eating the Y, so that means I'm shading up. And this one is also going to be dotted. First thing I notice is that I'm crossing the y-axis at 4, and then my slope is a -1, so I'm going down 1, right 1. And again, I'm going to have a dotted line. I look at my shading, and I'm supposed to shade up. So then I see where it overlaps, and I want to shade that in darker so that everybody knows where my shading is, which is right in that little triangle right there. All right, let's move on to number 6. So for number 6, again, take a look at our shading. The alligator is facing away from the Y, so that means I need to shade down. Okay, and then there's no line underneath the inequality, so that means that my line is going to be dotted. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 2, and then I'm going up 2 over 1, and I have a dotted line. And from that, I'm going to shade down, because that's what I decided before I started. Now let's take a look at this next one. The alligator's eating the Y, so that means I shade up, and there's that solid line underneath, so that means my line is solid. So I'm crossing at -3, and then I'm going down 1 over 1, and I'm going to have a solid line going through there. So then I'm going to shade up from the line. Okay, so now I want to take a look at where they overlap, and they overlap at this point right here. Okay, so that's my shading overlap is in that region right there. Just two more, guys, so hang on with me. So this one is a little bit different because this one we're actually going to have horizontal and vertical lines. Remember, if something is just x equals or x, it's going to be vertical. If something is just y equals, it's going to be just a horizontal line. So let's take a look at x is greater than 3. So let's think about this way. X is greater than 3. Well, that's going to be a vertical line. Okay, so I can't go up or down from my line because that's going to be on my line. That doesn't help me. So I want x to be greater than 3. Well, if you're thinking about the coordinate graph, okay, which way is x getting greater as you go left or right? Well, I see that the numbers are getting greater as you go to the right on the x-axis. So that means we need to shade to the right of our line. And then I see that there's no line underneath that inequality symbol, so I need to have a dotted line. So let's go ahead and graph that. So we're crossing the y-axis at 3, so I'm going to draw in my dotted line. And then I said that I wanted to shade to the right of it for it to be greater than. Now, my y is going to be a vertical line. So I notice that it's the inequality symbol is facing away, and since it's a horizontal line, I can still use that up and down idea. So I'm going to be shading down. All right, then I notice that there's no solid line underneath the inequality, so that's going to be a dotted line. So I'm crossing at -2, so I'm going to draw a horizontal line, and then I'm going to shade down. So what I notice is that I cross paths, my shading cross paths in this little rectangle right here. Okay, so that is the solution, is that little rectangle right there. Last but not least, let's take a look at number 8. So again, we have that whole x is less than, okay, where it's just x. So I know my line is going to be vertical. So my shading, if x is less than 4, x gets smaller as you go to the left. So that means I need to shade to the left. And there's no inequality, there's no line under that inequality. So that means my line is going to be dotted. So let's go ahead and let's graph that line. So we're crossing the y-axis or the x-axis, and we're going to have a vertical line at x is equal to 4. And then we're going to shade to the left of that line. Let's take a look at y is less than or equal to 6. So if y is less than or equal to 6, we're going to have a horizontal line, and since the alligator is facing away, we're going to shade down, and notice that little solid line underneath. That means we need to draw a solid line. So we have a solid line here, and then we're going to shade down from it. So actually, this whole big region right here is a solution. This whole large region right there is a solution to our problem. So that concludes our note video today. Go ahead and show me your completed note sheet when you're done, and I will give you the homework. Thanks for listening.